My blind date was a disaster. She spent the entire evening staring at her phone. Every question I asked got a one-word answer. Yes. No. Maybe. At one point she even sighed loudly and said, "This place is boring." I checked the time on my phone. Only 20 minutes had passed. 20 minutes felt like 2 hours. I was already reaching for my wallet when she finally looked up and said something that made everything worse. "You're not really my type." I blinked. "Then why did you agree to the date?" She shrugged. "My friend forced me." That was it. I pushed my chair back slightly and signaled for the bill. Worst blind date of my life. But as I stood up to leave, a waitress walked past our table. She paused for a moment. Then she leaned slightly closer and whispered something quietly. "If I were you, I'd stay." I frowned. "Why?" The waitress gave a small smile. Then she walked away without answering. I stood there confused. Why would I stay? My date had already gone back to scrolling through her phone. But something about the waitress's tone stuck in my mind. So instead of leaving, I sat back down. 5 minutes later my date suddenly stood up. "I'm leaving," she said. "Thanks for dinner." I stared at her. "You didn't even pay." She rolled her eyes. "You invited me." And just like that she walked out of the restaurant. No goodbye. No apology. Nothing. I sat there in silence. Embarrassed. Annoyed. And a little amused by how terrible the evening had been. Then the waitress returned with the bill. She placed it gently on the table. "Sorry about that," she said. I laughed awkwardly. "Was it that obvious?" She nodded. "Pretty much." I shook my head. "Well, thanks for the warning earlier." She tilted her head slightly. "What warning?" "You told me to stay." The waitress smiled. "I meant that." I raised an eyebrow. "Why?" For a moment she looked a little nervous. Then she said something unexpected. "Because I recognized you." That caught me off guard. "You did?" She nodded. "You probably don't remember me." I studied her face more carefully. Brown hair tied back. Soft eyes. A familiar smile. Something about her felt strangely familiar. But I couldn't place it. "I'm sorry," I said. "I don't think we've met." She laughed softly. I figured. Then she leaned slightly closer. "High school. Senior year." My brain suddenly clicked. "No way." She smiled wider. "It's me. Emma." And suddenly everything came rushing back. Emma Collins. The quiet girl from my high school art class. The girl who used to sit near the window and sketch in her notebook. The girl I had a crush on for almost an entire year. But I never had the courage to talk to her. "You work here?" I asked, surprised. "For now," she said. "I'm saving money for college." We both laughed. The awkward blind date had completely disappeared from my mind. For the next hour we talked. About school. About life. About the strange way we ended up meeting again. At some point Emma smiled and said something funny. "You know, when I saw you walk in tonight, I thought this was going to be interesting." "Why?" She pointed toward the door where my blind date had left. Because she didn't look happy to be here. I laughed. That obvious? Emma nodded. Very. Then she hesitated. Actually, there's another reason I told you to stay. What's that? She looked slightly embarrassed. Because I wanted to talk to you. I blinked. Really? She nodded slowly. I always wondered what would have happened if we talked back in high school. I felt my heart skip a beat. So did I. There was a quiet moment between us. Then Emma looked at the empty chair across from me. Well, technically your date left. Yeah. So. She smiled playfully. Mind if I take her seat? I laughed. Please. She sat down. And just like that, the worst blind date of my life turned into the most unexpected night I'd ever had. 2 hours later we were still talking. The restaurant was almost empty. As Emma stood up to leave, she looked at me with the same soft smile. You know something funny? What? If I hadn't been your waitress tonight, we probably never would have talked. I nodded. Yeah. Then I said something without even thinking. Maybe we should fix that. She raised an eyebrow. How? Dinner tomorrow, I said. This time without a terrible blind date. Emma laughed. I'd like that. And as she walked toward the kitchen, I realized something strange. Sometimes the worst night of your life can turn into the beginning of something amazing. All because someone leaned closer and whispered, if I were you, I'd stay. The next evening I arrived at the same restaurant 10 minutes early. Not because I was nervous. Okay, maybe a little. The place looked different tonight. Quieter. Calmer. Last night it had been the scene of the worst date of my life. Tonight, it felt like the beginning of something new. I chose a table near the window and kept glancing toward the door. Part of me wondered if Emma would actually come. Maybe she only agreed to be polite. Maybe she changed her mind. But just as that thought crossed my mind, the door opened. Emma walked in. But this time she wasn't wearing a waitress uniform. She wore a simple blue dress and her hair was down. For a moment I almost didn't recognize her. She looked completely different. And somehow even more beautiful. She spotted me and smiled. Hey. Hey, I replied, standing up quickly. She laughed softly. You look nervous. I'm not nervous, I said. Then I paused. Okay, maybe a little. She sat down across from me. So this is weird, she said. Yesterday I was bringing you the bill. And today we're on a date. I smiled. I prefer today. She laughed. So do I. The waiter came over and took our order. And for the first time in a long time, a conversation felt easy. Natural. Emma told me about her plans for college. She wanted to study design. I told her about my work and how I ended up in the city. Hours passed without us even noticing. At one point Emma looked at me curiously. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why didn't you talk to me in high school? I laughed awkwardly. Because I thought you were out of my league. Her eyes widened. Me? You were the mysterious art girl who barely talked to anyone. Emma shook her head. That's funny. Why? Because I had a huge crush on you. My brain stopped for a second. Wait, what? She nodded, slightly embarrassed. I thought you were the confident guy who talked to everyone. I laughed loudly. Emma. I was terrified of you. She covered her face laughing. So we both liked each other and nobody said anything. Pretty much. For a moment we both just sat there smiling. Then Emma leaned back in her chair and looked at me thoughtfully. You know something? What? If that terrible blind date hadn't happened, we still wouldn't be talking. I nodded. Yeah. And if you had left the restaurant when you wanted to, we probably never would have seen each other again. She smiled softly. Good thing you stayed. Outside the window the city lights reflected on the wet street. The same restaurant. The same place. But a completely different night. As the evening ended and we walked outside together, Emma looked up at the sky. You know what's strange, she said. What? The worst blind date of your life turned into the best night of mine. I smiled. Mine too. We stood there for a moment in the cool night air. Then Emma asked quietly. So, what happens next? I thought about it for a second. Then I smiled. Well, that depends. On what? On whether you're free this weekend. She laughed. I think I am. And just like that, what started as the worst date imaginable was slowly turning into something neither of us expected. And this time, I had no intention of leaving early. Over the next few weeks, Emma and I kept seeing each other. At first it was simple things. Coffee after her shift. Late night walks through the city. Small conversations that somehow lasted for hours. Every time we talked, I discovered something new about her. She was funny in a quiet way. The kind of person who noticed small details others ignored. She still carried a sketchbook everywhere she went. Sometimes when we sat in a cafe, she would suddenly start drawing. One evening I leaned over to look at what she was sketching. It was the restaurant. The same place where we first met again. You're really good, I said. Emma shrugged. It's just a hobby. I shook my head. No, it's more than that. She smiled but didn't argue. A few days later we were walking through a small park when she suddenly stopped near a bench. What's wrong? I asked. She looked down at her phone. Her expression had changed. Everything okay? I asked. She hesitated. Then she sighed. My boss. At the restaurant? She nodded. He wants me to start working more hours. That doesn't sound terrible. Emma gave a small, tired smile. It is when you're trying to save money for college. I frowned. You're still planning to leave the city? Yeah, she said quietly. In a few months. Something about that answer made my chest feel tight. For the first time since we started seeing each other, I realized something important. Emma might not stay here forever. A few nights later we went back to the same restaurant again. This time she was working. I sat at a table near the window while she moved between customers with her usual calm smile. At one point she came over to refill my coffee. You know, she said playfully, this might be the first time someone came to a restaurant just to watch the waitress work. I laughed. Guilty. She leaned slightly closer. Are you stalking me? Maybe. She shook her head smiling. You're weird. But you like it, I replied. Before she could answer, her manager called her name from across the room. Emma. Table 5. She rolled her eyes slightly. Duty calls. As she walked away, I noticed something strange. The manager looked irritated. Watching her closely. Too closely. An hour later the restaurant started closing. Emma finally sat down across from me looking exhausted. That was a long shift, she said. You look tired. I am. She leaned back and closed her eyes for a second. You know something funny, she said. What? If you hadn't had that terrible blind date, you wouldn't be sitting here right now. I smiled. Best disaster of my life. Emma laughed softly. Then her expression became thoughtful. Can I tell you something honestly? Of course. When you first came into the restaurant that night, I almost didn't talk to you. Why? She looked slightly embarrassed. Because I thought you wouldn't remember me. I shook my head. I'm glad you did. She smiled quietly. So am I. For a moment we just sat there in comfortable silence. Then suddenly the manager walked over. His tone was sharp. Emma, we need to talk. Emma immediately looked uneasy. What about? Now. She stood up slowly and followed him toward the back office. Something about the situation didn't feel right. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Finally the office door opened. Emma stepped out. Her eyes looked different. Worried. I stood up quickly. What happened? She tried to smile. But it didn't quite work. I think I just lost my job. My stomach dropped. What? Emma sighed quietly. He said the restaurant is cutting staff. That doesn't make sense, I said. You're one of the best workers here. She shrugged. Apparently not anymore. For a moment neither of us spoke. The restaurant around us was empty now. Chairs stacked. Lights dimmed. Emma grabbed her jacket. I guess this means I'll have to find another job. Then she looked at me and tried to laugh. Well, at least our story started here. I looked at the quiet restaurant. Then back at her. And suddenly I had a strange feeling. That terrible blind date was only the beginning of a much bigger story.